Welcome back. You're watching Sokoni. This is the tail end of the program right now. We want to focus on what is happening, of course, at the National Treasury, where state agencies, they're saying they will misuse the law to withdraw billions. This is Auditor General Nasi Gadungu has decried the misuse, as I mentioned earlier, of the law by Ministries Department and state agencies to withdraw billions from the exchequer to fund projects that are not urgent. Article 2.3 of the Constitution allows the Treasury to spend on emergencies without parliamentary approval. The law demands that the Treasury seeks approval of Parliament within 2 months after withdrawal of money from the consolidated fund. If Parliament is in recess, the Treasury must get the approval within 2 weeks after resumption of sitting. The law stipulates that every financial year, the national government must not spend more than 10% of the sum appropriated by Parliament unless MPs have approved a higher percentage under exceptional circumstances. However, a special report by Ms. Gadungu tabled in Parliament has revealed how MDAs resort to the emergencies, quote-unquote, clause to spend money on projects and activities that would ordinarily be included in their budgets. According to the report, for the 10-year tenure of former President Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy William Ruto and the first financial year of the Kenya Kwanza administration, the executive withdrew 147 billion shillings, as you can see it here. Bunyasi Sakwa, I just want us to just pick up on this briefly as we continue with the conversation. Yes.
This is an old problem. It's been around for a very long time. That, first of all, the provision that government can spend up to a certain limit, which is under Article 223 that has been mentioned, is sound because it takes a while for the legal processes to be enacted into law to enable disbursement of funds, and you don't want a halt in the processes of government, activities of government. But it is generally abused. It enables ministries to do things that might otherwise, yes indeed, not have been authorized. No, authorized definitely, but maybe not prioritized at that time. And that's why I guess they do it before it becomes a de facto situation when Parliament resumes and they have to go and report back. And it's normally just reporting back. They're not seeking authority. They simply inform Parliament that we did this while you are away. And I think it's a good practice to provide continuity. But what is lacking is a regime of sanctions for those who are blatantly flouting it. Sometimes we find not just non-priority items, but items that should not be on the list whatsoever. So it becomes the jury situation that this is now been inserted. We have already spent money on it, and we will lose a lot if we do not continue funding and so on. So that's a matter beyond the dialogue between Treasury and Parliament. I think it's a matter that requires explicit sanctions when that occurs. But it is a real problem. And she is giving us a peek into what has happened in the last 11 years, 10 years of Uhuru Ruto and 1 year of Ruto. But it's really an old problem. It also tells us how slow we are at getting the headlines of the right things. That should have been a headline 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And therefore it should now turn out to be, there should be a clear legal guideline on what must not be done. So it becomes an absolute barrier. And if anybody does it, the obligation should be personal. Like there are some laws, there are some aspects of the law in which if you spend outside of what has been appropriated, you have an element of personal responsibility as well in it. I think it should come out like that, and it will begin impacting on people's potential pensions and even security of tenure, and maybe they'll be more cautious. But there is a tendency to blatantly disregard it and then say, oops, later when it's found out, and say, we'll proceed as is required. And the following year, the same thing happens and so on. The sanctions are not firm enough.
Yeah, firm enough, no. I think it begins also with Parliament. If there is abuse of Article 223, it behooves Parliament to try and plug this hole, because this has been abused.
Yes.
Recently, we saw also Telkom Kenya, they were using still their Article 1, Article
in fact,
223.
Parliament can indeed come out.
Is it Parliament which is failing?
It's Parliament that is failing. You can't expect the executive to supervise itself, oversight itself, and come out with hard sanctions. They're the ones originating it as a government. So it's Parliament that needs to come out and amend the PFM Act as well as what is in the other statutes to make it, restriction. I think some allowance for continuity is good, but I think blatant disregard, or let's say disregard, should be punished.
Debal, in my view, I think the blame may go both ways, because in as much as we may want to hold Parliament to account here, how about if Parliament didn't know that there were such expenditures? So I think, of course, Parliament has got to always be on the alert, but it's also incumbent upon the executive that, yes, because the laws are there that allows them to spend without prior authority to spend, but then it's beholden upon them to come within a certain time to let Parliament know that there was this emergency and we used these funds. Can it be approved? So the blame goes both ways. But I fully agree with the chairman when he says, look, some of that culpability needs to be personal, so that if an office abuses that power to spend and fails to request for, or even spends on the wrong things, then it should be not just mali ya serikali. There should be personal. But lastly, it's interesting with a light touch that Mheshimiwa is talking of Ruto regime, but he's not talking of Ruto Gachagua regime. With a light touch.
All right, let's see what is happening with the coffee auction. This week's coffee auction, held on Tuesday, recorded significant rise in trading activity, with both volumes and value-added traded posting significant gains. The weekly trade saw the volume of coffee traded jump 35% to 30,272 bags compared to last week, with a value of 1.3 billion shillings, which reflects a rise of 35%. The highest price achieved was $499 per 50 kg bag from Ndaro Coffee Society in Nyeri. The higher price is equivalent to 224 per kilogram of sherry at Factory Gate. The average price also increased by 19% to $290 from the previous $244 per 50 kilogram bag. The average price is equivalent to 130 per kilogram of sherry. The top 10 prizes went to coffee societies in Nyeri and Kirinyaga counties. Right, let's see, because I think the bit of coffee reforms, even if you're talking about the Deputy President as well, could this also be indicative of the reforms? That does it really come to bear? And this is where I want to rope you in as well. Chair, Kitoni.
Debal, this is, I don't even know what to say about this. I'm a coffee grower, and I'm involved in that coffee value chain, and I see these stories every day in the media. My reality is slightly different. As I'm talking to you now, I have significant tonnage of coffee here in Nairobi, in Mombasa Road. As you know, coffee is a high-value product, and I cannot keep it on the estate because of the risks that are attended to it. I have spoken severally about the coffee reforms, and the coffee reforms seem to be very well intended, but they seem to be skewed largely in favor of smallholder farmers operating under cooperative societies. And in many instances, most of those cooperative societies are from one region in this country. The reality is that those coffee reforms were mooted largely to the exclusion of estate owners. And the truth also is that if you're going to do things to scale, and again I have emphasized the need for scale in all the things that we do in this country, in order for you to be a significant player. I mean, look at Brazil today. Coffee prices globally are going to be subdued for the next 4 years because of what Brazil has done. They've come into the market in a huge way. They've mechanized. They have come in with even advanced robotics on their farming at farm level. And that was because of the big brunt that they bore during the COVID period. So Brazil has completely revolutionized their coffee industry. Here in Kenya, I think there's a big case to be made in terms of our production. We are still doing so little on production. We need to be like other countries like Colombia that looks like at every coffee tree as a national resource. And they look at the productivity right to the farm in terms of what it is producing. For me, I think as a country, there's a big case to be made for ramping up production. But these prices that we see posted in the media, they're temporary. They're today high, tomorrow low. I don't think we have a consistent case of development of this value chain to a point that it benefits many. I have a lot of coffee in industrial areas today I cannot sell. The last price I got was $160 a 50 kg bag, which is 50% what I was getting this time last year. So I want to actually go to the exchange later today and see where these prices they're getting are from, because for us as estate owners, I know many estate owners like myself who are in a similar situation. We have coffee, we are not getting the prices that we would like to get. And that is the truth.
Right. Any bit of coffee that you also grow, Patrick Opatha, aside from avocados?
No, I'm an avocado farmer through and through. Coffee, I know there is my grandfather tried coffee in our home almost 50 years ago, just to prove that coffee could grow in Nyanza. And it did, and produced a lot, but nobody took it up. Yeah, I think you have to go to Vihiga, Maragoli, and that side to find coffee. But I think I agree with Kip on this one. The issue of state coming into a value chain and trying to control the value chain because of a specific constituency that is making noise, I think is the wrong thing to happen. We are seeing the same thing happening in the tea. Tea was working in a reasonable way, and the reforms that were needed were very minimal. But then the government came in a big way and started, it's now a political thing when, I really always have a big smile and, and enjoy my cup of tea when I see somebody flagging off fertilizer. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that you've imported fertilizer and all of a sudden you're flagging it off to the farm, right? That is a value chain that should work normally without any interference at all. But when you find people now beginning to talk about different sectors of the value chain without looking at the total value chain and looking at how to make it best, you find that everything gets skewed, and it is skewed towards making the news that somebody wants to hear. And high prices here is what is consumed. But how that is arrived at, it may be a particular consignment with a particular individual buyer who came in and offered that at the auction, maybe for some particular reason, and that is then what is brought out into the news. The reforms that are happening in the agricultural sector really needs to be looked at a complete value chain level and looked at from outside in terms of what is going to make that value chain worthwhile for everybody in a sustainable manner. And in 2018, the government put out a paper then around Kenya becoming an export, an exporting country. And the big push at that time was to say that in agriculture, which was going to be the big push, you need to make them so large that what they're doing is creating a value chain for export. And when that happens, then the cost of living in Kenya will come down because the unit cost comes right down. And by making them really large, then you can start putting value addition facilities in Kenya, because there is sufficient volume to actually feed the value addition activities. Even maize, we can make cornstarch, we can make a whole host of other things with maize, not just grow maize for us to make ugali. Yeah? And when you start doing cornstarch and other derivatives from maize, you are then able to, to reward the farmer at a better level than selling maize purely to be ground for ugali. That does not really add value to the, to the producer. And the same thing with coffee and tea. We really need to, and tea got there. It's big enough globally for them to be able to sort of have a good value chain. So I think we should just leave those value chains to work best for themselves, set themselves up, have a series of guidelines, and let the players there really make it work for them. But I agree with Kip. Scale is the main thing for all of these to make it work. And coffee, I will watch with interest to see what happens.
All right.
You know, a quick one on this one. The history of coffee and coffee growing, which came from the colonial period, was a very over-regulated thing. You know that you had to get a license for the number of trees you could plant, and the local administration would come around to check that you have not done more, and that kind of thing. And at that time, the idea was not to compete with the white farmers, and so the Africans were to sort of be tightly regulated. And I think since then, fiddling, I would call it, government fiddling, the coffee sector has been extensive, sometimes resulting in a tendency to overprotect local farmers relative to other local producers of other crops. There isn't, you don't get parity in the way government is treating its agricultural producers across the board. You know, some like coffee, like tea, like sugarcane, tend to get too much attention, and that's not how you're going to be able to develop the sector. I think they must allow some cold winds to blow sometimes, and then they must also have a big view of where they're heading. If you don't have a perspective view, it's just going to mess up and provide subsidies, as it turns out, to a few people at a time that happen to be current at that time. I just have not believed that is intervention of government is necessary. The coffee sector is highly nuanced in terms of its value chain, and governments can't play a very effective role in those highly nuanced and niche markets in which it operates.
All right, Shemochuto, briefly.
The BAL creating an enabling environment for the coffee sector and indeed improving the value chain is important. Often talking to young people about agriculture, of course the fear is farming, and a little assessment is that when you look at the value chain, the actual farming and cultivation is a small but critical part of the cog. I think if we cleaned and empowered the young people to participate in the other aspects of the value chain, it would be vital. Giving good prices for coffee, of course, is a welcome development. Although not a coffee farmer, I only went to school by coffee. Our parents in Nyanza, used to grow coffee, and there were very strong cooperatives, at least in Homa Bay County or Ugis. And maybe aggregation, in as much as we would be promoting the bigger farmers, commercial scale, but I think also aspects of aggregation so that the smaller players also have their place. Somebody, I don't know if I read it somewhere or not, that Uganda is now one of the leading producers of coffee. We need to find out what is Colombo doing right, and I think Colombians were here this week or last week. Let's not only have good rapport, camaraderie with them, but go a step further. What is it that we can learn from the Caribbean that they're doing well? And the same applies to sugarcane. I do know Barbados are doing very well. And I'm hoping that when Kakamega have their investment conference next month, that the High Commission of Barbados will participate so that they share experiences. What can be done so that sugar can also produce more? So the BAL, I think I could leave it at that. But with a light touch again, when I was talking of Ruto Gachagua, to be fair to Honorable, I think it's the public perception and also the media. We don't seem to be capturing that much enough. So it's not that there's any bad intention.
No, but the buck stops only with the president.
Right, at the end of the day.
Yes, buck stopped with Uhuru. Buck stops
you
with
are
Ruto.
right. Uganda is producing over 10 times our coffee.
Okay.
And it's, they worked on their agronomy, they worked on their productivity, they have looked at the value chain in its totality, they have allowed the laws of demand and supply to operate. I think here we have got too much interventionism, and the example Patrick Obath used is absolutely correct. I mean, why flag off fertilizer? Fertilizer is a tradable commodity. I mean, we have companies here in Kenya that have invested in fertilizer plants.
Right.
Are they being given equal opportunity? I mean, I know many people who've closed fertilizer plants that were employing, providing gainful employment to Kenyans.
Sure.
I really think we need to go back to the basics. Let's work on the agronomy. Let's have a strategic plan. Let's see where we would like this value chain to be in 10 years' time. And from there, we have a story to tell.
All right.
But then if we just doing a knee-jerk reaction saying, fine, there's a stakeholding group here, they are cooperators, they are voters, let's go and look at what they want, how much money we give them, let's create a fund, pay them in advance for their crop. What happens to the rest?
Right.
Yes, and by the way,
Right.
in respect of coffee, in the 70s, particularly 60s, 70s, probably into the 80s, Kenya was at the forefront in research in agronomy globally. We provided technical assistance to several countries. We did Papua New Guinea is one coffee producer that depended on us. Our research, and I had a chance to work with the researchers from Brazil and other places, depended on the Coffee Research Foundation of Kenya. It was a private sector. It's fully funded internally in the industry and not by national government. And it had really reputable researchers and so on. We were playing a leading role. We must get to a point of greater confidence that we want to be not regional players, we want to be the best globally and so on. And that's somewhere sometimes that we compare ourselves, the comparators will not get us there. We really must aim to be the very best, and we can. And I think government should take a step back a bit. And the interventionist thing is not going to help. It's not going to help, in my view.
Right, thank you. Just briefly, I know you wanted to just comment a bit about the AU chairmanship. That is Right Honorable Raila Odinga's gagging for that particular seat and what it does really portend. Looking at the Daily today, it says that maybe there could be a sting at the end of a tail as far as the AU race is concerned, that former Prime Minister Raila Odinga may have won the endorsement of his political arch and nemesis, that is President William Ruto, to seek the position of chairmanship or the chairperson of the AU Commission, but he must now wait to see if AU member states will adopt or reject proposed election rule that may as well lock him out of the 2025 contest. I just wanted to give it a business perspective on how that is very indicative for Kenya being or garnering this or getting this particular seat. Kiprono Kitone, briefly.
First of all, I would say that, certainly Honorable Raila Odinga has the credentials to ascend to that high office, and I do believe he has the experience, he's got the leadership mettle to be able to rise to the occasion on behalf of Kenya. But however, I don't know why, but Kenya has not been very competitive. We've not been successful at many of the attempts to get regional or even global positions. If we look at the share of regional and global positions, be it in the United Nations, be it in the African Union, be it in the regional development banks, etc., I would say we've not had our fair share. And if we look at many countries like in Francophone Africa, in West Africa, they've been much more successful than we have been. And I'm not sure whether it is a matter of diplomatic strategy, a question of diplomatic strategy, or perhaps an inability to put together a campaign that ends up yielding the result. You remember when Amina Mohammed was competing to be Secretary General of the UN, and we all thought that she was going to win, and in the last minute, that did not come to pass. So I think as a country, we must put our best foot forward. We need to engage all the other actors in the continent and see to it that this position does come to a Kenyan in the name of Honorable Raila Odinga.
All right.
I think there's something else, Kip, that adds on to that. And this is the fact that when you go below the political level in those organizations, there are not that many Kenyans. When you look at, the under-secretary generals and what have you and everything else, in a lot of these organizations, you don't find many Kenyans in that space. And if we are not present at that level whereby that supports the diplomacy that goes behind at the political level, then you won't have enough people. And the support might not be there. I am very surprised that when you look at the UN agencies, the number of Ethiopians present is incredible. Just look right now at all the UN agencies and go below the Secretary General and look at that level. There are a lot of Ethiopians. There are a lot of people from Cote d'Ivoire, a lot of people from the odd, the odd countries that you always hear popping up in these places, they have a lot of people at the Under-Secretary General and then the policy level in those places. And that already gives them the presence at top of mind in terms of getting up to that level. And I think Kenya really needs to start working on being present in a lot of those areas. The issue of exporting or getting jobs for Kenyans, that is where we should go, because that will open up a lot of opportunities for us. And it's been, I think, the issue of these things, a lot of times we start literally 3 months, 4 months before the thing is due, rather than start 5 or 6 years beforehand and get people to be on your side slowly, rather than doing this campaign at the last minute. If we did it earlier and then you did this last minute campaign to sort of solidify the support that you had, it might change. But for this to just come out, as a result of some agreement last year, to sort of front our candidate for the top job in the AU, it is probably 1 year too late.
Right now that we have the president really indicating that we are all behind Raila Odinga, could we give also the same campaign machinery that was given to the non-representative seat at the United Nations Security Council? We saw a whole diplomatic structure of a campaign around it being led by then CS Monica Juma, so that we can actually juxtapose with what Patrick is saying. We don't do it way too late at the end of the day.
Thanks, Debal. I think, first of all, this wholeheartedness of a nation behind these placements is very important in succeeding to get those placements. Even though they may be competitive in terms of technical qualifications, state support is always important. But for many years, Kenya has not been of one heart in promoting their citizens. I have seen it while I was outside the World Bank, that it was difficult to get a single candidate support. This government supporting a particular candidate always seemed to take a number of considerations that would sometimes diminish the intensity of government support. Whereas small countries like Togo, Ghana, some West African countries were doing a much better job. But also at the technical level, the West Africans beat us a bit in bilingualism. That tends to be of help as well. And Ethiopia, despite its being a federal and highly competitive federal state at the national levels within Ethiopia, they succeed to get out candidates and to push them. And they're all over the place, as my colleagues have said. So I think Kenya is now getting there, and I think we are acting a lot more mature about this now. And despite the political confusion that might come out at the interpretation of what supporting Raila is by President Ruto, what it might mean, it's still one singular benefit of this is that the president's apparent wholeheartedness in supporting Raila is essential for him to clinch this seat. Any variations around that, any softness around that would fail it, among other reasons that provide a challenge. I really think this will be a good example going into the future in supporting our candidates. And Kenya has got the human resource base to be competitive.
Debala, I start from the point that there are quite significant number of Kenyans in the UN system. Actually, one direct benefit of that is that Kenya doesn't pay, maybe some Kenyans don't know, it's a contribution to the UN because the Kenyans who work there are already doing it. In fact, when we talk of remittances, that's not usually counted, what the Kenyans in the UN system contribute. But having said that, I fully agree with our colleagues. We have not been pushy we have not been strategic. I think having worked in Rwanda, I saw how strategic they could be to go for certain key positions. It's so sad that we now don't have any Kenyan heading a global UN agency. At least as up to 2 years ago, we had two. We had Dr. Mukisa leading UNCTAD, and then we had Ambassador Bishar leading UPU, Universal Postal Union. Now we don't have any. So we need to do a lot more in that regard. But I was delighted yesterday that Bala participated, the Ministry of Labor had a workshop looking at, there is a draft strategy, national strategy on skills development for migrant labor. I think that's the way to go. In parallel, there was also a meeting in Mombasa yesterday, the Maritime Affairs at Kenya Maritime Authority. There are, I think, thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of opportunity in the blue economy, in the seafarers potential that we need to harness at a nation. But having said that, in terms of the UN, I could not agree more. The Right Honorable is fully qualified, and having been part of the AU, there has been quite a bit of problem with the current administration. And I wanted also to say, when we talk of East Africa, actually the region or how it's structured, it's not just the EAC. The East Africa region is 14 countries from Madagascar all the way to Ethiopia. If they throw their weight behind the Right Honorable, I see has good prospects of winning. There's this talk of the new rules. I think at that level it's more political. Since this has not been adopted, the heads of state may decide, of course one can't talk for them, but they may decide this becomes applicable, not immediately. I remember in Parliament, there are rules that you'd say they apply in the next season, but not immediately. So we wish him well. And I hope he brings order. There's been quite a bit of trouble, particularly governance at the AU Commission.
Right, but perhaps maybe even when he began at this particular seat, one of the things that will be up on his interest will to stimulate the conversation around the Africa Free Trade Continental trade area, because I think that has actually taken a back step, so to speak, and there's no much conversation and activity that we can see on how the potential of it could spur economic growth in Africa in terms of trading volumes.
You know, when the treaty for the African Continental Free Trade Area was signed in Kigali in 2015 or 16, I think we all celebrated. We all popped a glass of champagne thinking that it's ushering a new era of free trade, mobility of capital, mobility of goods and services, and a new era of prosperity where Africans would look inward and enhance the equation of intra-African trade. And that, alongside the conversation of the many infrastructural corridors that are being developed across the continent to enable this to happen, including even the internet, that has been, the fiber cables that have been spread across the continent. We were sure that this is going to be, is going to happen. However, like in many trade conversations, most of these things sort of just die at the pen that signs the treaty. Right. Translating this into commercial activity, nation to nation, bilateral and multilateral commercial engagements, and breaking down the non-tariff barriers and other bureaucratic obstacles to make sure that this mobility does take place, has not happened. And I do not want to blame the politicians. I don't want to blame the bureaucrats. I also want to apportion blame on we, the business people, because we have not demanded to have these corridors open. In fact, many times you'll find that, and we saw this recently even in Nigeria and other countries, where the business community takes a very, very inward and protective position on issues, and it makes it very difficult for people to trade and go and break those barriers. I mean, when we went to Nigeria in 2015, and the Kenya government at that time was planning to sign a special status agreement with Nigeria, it wasn't ratified by ECOWAS. And at that time, Nigeria, and I'm sure to this day, still imports dairy products from New Zealand. And Kenya has a surplus in dairy products. Yeah, and in that same special status agreement, I remember Nigeria was to help Kenya in developing its capacity in oil exploration and other technical support around the whole exploration activity. That never happened. Why? Because they never got the ratification from ECOWAS. So really, I think it's time that we bit the bullet. It's time we confronted this thing head on. It's time that we make these treaties a reality.
So maybe the business communities, the chambers of the various countries in Africa as well have not been making the noise as the president Gabon will put it. You've not been making, KEPSA has not been making noise, the Kenya Chamber of Commerce has not been making noise. You need a collective voice so that you can actually try and steamroll this. Sure. Just as you said, I think you oriented my thought where I wanted to go. But let me just hear from Patrick, from Kenya KEPSA's perspective. How will this be exceedingly beneficial for you, and how can you voice, your concern on this on the slow uptake of this trading area?
I'll speak on two items, and I think Kip has touched on one in terms of the generating the infrastructure to do trade. I've sat on the board of an organization called Trademark, and over the last 13 years, our job has been to remove barriers in terms of the trade corridors that are happening. So the Northern and Central Corridor in East Africa, we've been able to streamline the movement of goods along that corridor. Things like having cargo tracking for trucks from Mombasa Port to Kigali. So you don't need to check every time, about goods moving. Mm-hmm. The one-stop border posts, where it used to take 3 days to cross the border, you can now do it within half a day, right? And we are moving towards ensuring that you have what is called a green gate at the borders. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if a truck has been cleared by Uganda and Rwanda customs in Mombasa, they are able to then drive without having to be checked at the border, because they've been sealed, they're geotagged, they're geofenced, and even the driver is tagged as well with the vehicle, so that when they're going, nothing changes on the route, and then they just go, they reach the border, they go through the green gate, and it should therefore take no more than 3 days from Mombasa to Kigali if all the governments make that work. You now come to what Kip has talked about, just the bureaucracy that is brought in to protect, on a very sort of probably a very myopic scale, myopic view, to protect our industry in our country. Us as the private sector, that is the biggest problem that we have. Once the association, the chambers, the KEPSAs, or whatever it is, are saying, let's open up trade within East Africa, and we are talking about removing non-tariff barriers between one country and the next, you find that specific individual business people who have got contacts, quote, in the government, in the government bureaucracy, will go and say, we need to block this thing because it is spoiling my company. And that, all of a sudden, you find a non-tariff barrier appearing. And it's as simple as KEBS in Kenya or the National Bureau of Standards in Uganda or Tanzania inserting one clause in the specification of sugar to be imported into Uganda. It may be just one line that changes the percentage of a particular quantity from, say, 7 to 12%, right? And the minute that happens, it means that imports can't come in unless they meet the 12%. Yet what is being produced and consumed in Uganda is at 7%, for example. And it is done by unscrupulous businessmen trying to protect their little fiefdoms, as it were, not realizing that if you open trade, which is what AFCTA is supposed to do, you are now having an opportunity of 1.1 billion Africans as your potential market. And that is big enough for maybe 3 or 4 times the size of your company doing business in that area, and they still want to be able to exhaust the opportunities. So as business associations, yes, we do a lot of work in terms of ensuring that we open the corridors. But individual businessmen who think that they're kingpins, yeah, as a king joked about during, I think our president joked about during the king's visit here. Yeah, those who think they're kingpins, they are the ones who go ahead and try and introduce these barriers. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to get our governments to ignore those kind of things and embrace fully what we as trade associations are trying to push in terms of freeing trade across Africa. Mm-hmm. It's a huge opportunity, and going back to what we were talking about earlier on, the ability to have volumes of trade, right? The easiest place to get those volumes moving is within Africa for Africa. Mm-hmm. But if you're trying to fight, the Colombians to exporting to Europe, that's a big battle. Mm-hmm. But if within Africa we just open up and free off our trade, I mean, how many countries in Africa grow coffee? Not that many.
Not many.
So if just the African countries could export coffee to Africa, we are good. Yeah, sugar to Africa, we are good. Tea to Africa, we are good. But we don't think beyond the fact that I'm protecting my small stuff, right? Rather than saying, let's open it up. And if it's competition, I've got to grow up, I've got to scale up, and I've got to be smarter. And that is how my business will grow, not through political protection.
Thank you. Lastly, as we are winding up, unless Binyasa, you wanted to add something? We want to head over to Ghana, where we can see the parliament has passed a legislation that intensifies a crackdown on the rights of LGBTQ people and those promoting lesbians, gays, or other non-conventional sexual or gender identities in the West African country. Gay sex was already punishable by up to 3 years in prison. The bill now also imposes a prison sentence of up to 5 years for the willful promotion, sponsorship, or support of LGBTQ plus activities. The bill, one of the harshest of its kind in Africa, a coalition of Christian, Muslim, and Ghanaian traditional leaders sponsored the legislation. Let's just listen to what really transpired there.
I'm not the only one who is coming with an application for second consideration. This is the third time that the sponsors themselves have come to this house for second consideration. The third time. Twice on notice, one without notice. So, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be out of place to pray, to be accommodated, to enable me file my amendments. Mr. Speaker, I believe that instead of going viva voce, instead of using the extempore approach, if I file and its same appear on the other paper and members are able to read, they will get a sense of my point. And then we'll be able to have a law that all of us would appreciate its import. Mr. Speaker, should we hurriedly suspend the rules and say that we are past it?
In the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the Bible says that to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under the heaven. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. And I believe the time for the third reading of this bill is now.
Those in favor that the Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill 2021 be taken through the third reading, say aye. Aye. Those against, say no.
All right, so what will be the implications of passing of this legislation, just looking at a point of reference, what is happening in Uganda, where the foreign aid has been withdrawn, especially from the US because of that legislation. We know where Ghana is at regarding especially their sovereign debt, and this will actually go down to exacerbate what is already the worst, that as far as economy is concerned. So we have AGOA, which was also drawn back by the US in Uganda, and a lot of other ramifications from the Bretton Woods institutions. I just wanted to just begin from there with you, Binyasa Sakwa.
Thank you. I think, first of all, my own personal belief is that we need a bit more broad-minded thinking around this LGBTQ business. I am a Catholic, and I realize that even the Pope seems to have softened somewhat, that it says the church can bless unions. He didn't say marriages, but I guess it comes about the same thing. So there is a certain value system that the rich countries are trying to impose on everybody, and mainstream churches like Catholics are softening at the margin. I think maybe 50 years from now, or maybe some shorter period than that, nobody will care about that, and this may just become okay. Now, but the only problem we have is how the countries like the US are quite prepared to use whatever they happen to have agreed on politically to the rest of the world. There was a time when they had completely outlawed any form of population management initiatives. And they had so required that you couldn't, if you ever provided any counseling around population management, you would be in contravention of their requirements and the law, and therefore they would withdraw their funding. And that meant that for countries like ours that had a very active population management program, family planning and things like that, counseling for, against abortion, whatever those were, those programs were all hindered, encumbered by the U.S. Tendency to put in their oppressive arm. I think many countries are going to pass legislations as a form of rebellion against that attitude. You can see after Uganda did it, Ghana, which used to be at the forefront, is also doing it, and maybe a few other countries, simply to spite that requirement by the U.S. Now it is LGBTQ they are supporting. Next time might be something else. And there are normally many, many different things depending on what the U.S. voting population decides. So I think it's going to become problematic for the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. Patrick Obath?
I think the whole essence of LGBTQ, it started off with the Q, the first one, in the English language. And that thing has expanded. There's also a plus at the end. Yeah? It's just adding on a whole host of
other queerness.
Of other, of other orientations. Let me put it that way. But I think to try and globalize issues that are sensitive in a cultural sense, I think is wrong. The African continent has got its own view, and I think it's generally the whole continent around issues like LGBTQ. The South Americans, the Europeans, the Americans, everybody has got a view around this. Let me just divert to things like, let me say, abortion. Yeah, abortion has also got its own, just within the US. There is tensions around just that word. France is about to make abortion a constitutional right. They're going through the process in the French parliament at the moment. So when you start looking at personal freedoms, personal choices, and then trying to force one view against another, you will create a backlash when you force it in one direction. Say within Africa, to say you have to go into, you have to recognize LGBTQ. Before it became an issue and came to the forefront of discussion, it was just one of those things that was kept in the background. You didn't talk about it, it was there and you shut your eyes to it and it just went on. But the minute you brought it to the forefront, you now begin to get the coalescing of views. And in Africa, generally in Africa, the views are very, very strong against LGBTQ. And by campaigning to try and say it is people's rights, they need that, the right of choice or orientation they need to have, the religious elements in Africa are very, very strong. If you find in the religious world these days, it is Africa that is sending missionaries to Europe, not the other way around. That used to happen. So that strength of feeling means that the stronger or the more voluble the discussion happens, the more likely you are to get legislation against those orientations that people had and never used to talk about. So mine is that I think the pro-LGBTQ teams and all the people want to talk about it, it may be time to reconsider how you want to promote those orientations within Africa and avoid having the kind of stuff that happened in Uganda, it's happening in Ghana, and you can be sure that if it's happened like that in two countries, one very progressive, in fact very progressive countries, it's likely to happen more and more in other countries as noise is made.
Correct.
And then to use trade as a kind of, or lack of trade as a kind of a whip against this, I think is not the right thing to do. In your country, you've done it. Recognize that another country has got their own dispensation. Let them deal with it in their own way, but rise above these discussions that are very, very sensitive within the cultural environment. Rise above that, and if you want to trade, let's trade at a trade level. Let's not trade at a cultural level.
At a cultural level. Right. We are love to this fact also. We have these issues that has been, I think, spoken on the floor of the House of the National Assembly. There's a bill that also Honorable Peter Kaluma of Homa Bay came up with. The Supreme Court made its decision on it as well. So when we see it happening around us, let's not just also rest on our laurels and think that it cannot really affect us at the end of the day, because I think this is live in Parliament, so to speak, is a matter, and there is a legislation in this regard as well. Honorable Kitoni, briefly, as we wind up.
I don't think I want to say much more than Patrick Obath has already said. I mean, it's a sensitive topic. As an African and as a Christian, I think the positions are very clear. We may not agree with it, but again, it's 2024, and I think there is a need. I mean, do they have a right to exist? Yes, of course they do. And we agree with it, maybe not. Whether it should be imposed down our throats, absolutely not.
But on the aspect of also the developing countries weaponizing it in terms of sanctions, so to speak.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I don't agree with it being imposed upon us as a value that we must embrace in our society. I don't agree. But I think we've got to be cognizant of the fact that we're in an evolving world. Things are changing very rapidly. The developed Western nations have a very strong affinity towards allowing a much more liberal societal framework, and it's their right.
Thank you.
I wouldn't want to add much more, but just allow me, Debal, to make my final closing remarks as well.
Yes.
I was very pleased with what I saw in Homa Bay last week, and I want to congratulate Governor Gladys Wanga. I mean, the fact that she's doing what she's doing, galvanizing her communities and putting together an investment forum like she has done, I think it showed a lot of leadership and a lot of vision on the part of some of the governors we have in this country. I don't want to single her out alone, but I think there are many governors around this country who are doing a great job, including my own governor in Trans Nzoia, Natembea, and others who are doing such good jobs on the ground to make sure that they're alleviating the problems of the common person on the ground. And even the words that were used by Senator Kajwang in Homa Bay, I think it's a sign that our political democracy is maturing. And I think, to me, that was a good thing that happened in the course of this week.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Patrick,
our constitution recognizes cultural and norms. I'd want also to add my voice from a faith perspective, that our partners need to appreciate and recognize some African cultural norms that need to be respected like we do theirs. But my parting shot, Debal, maybe Africa needs to be stronger in this regard. I know earlier on the talk of the AU and the summit. A lot of good things are decided on by heads of state, either in Addis or Lusaka or wherever. But unless the foot soldiers, the private sector in particular, take them into action, they'll remain that. I remember, for example, there was the African Investment Fund, where the late Chris Kurubi was to be treasurer, to be set up in Mauritius. Unless the private sector takes lead and actualizes, it will remain that. Lastly, it may be helpful for Kenyans to understand the dynamics. When Kip said that there was conversation between Nigeria and Kenya, and then ECOWAS vetoed it. The difference between ECOWAS and EAC, in our case, the national is supreme. The AU system, the challenge is also that the nation is supreme. So Kenya, EAC wouldn't have stopped us, but for ECOWAS, because it's supreme, that happened.
So
we need to harmonize, even our recs, how they operate.
Right, but just closing remarks?
Yes, I just think that the richer countries, the US particularly, shouldn't use sanctions, trade sanctions, to enforce an unacceptable and an unpleasant cultural practice. I think the old system, even within Africa, for example, within Kenya as well, was better, that these were fringe activities. They didn't need to raise it to the level of legislation and therefore publicize it and so on. And if you, in any language you find there is a local word for any of those LGBTQs, it means it existed. And we have those local words in some of our languages. They did exist, but they existed on the fringe and they were underground. And I don't think you need to dig it out, legislate against. And in the US, these are transient decisions because the division within the country is almost 50-50 politically. There'll come another administration that will not care about it. And so, I think it's just not right.
Thank you.
But just on the local scene, I think that we should, when the county should follow the example of Homa Bay, and I know that Kirinyaga did that before, and I'm sure there are a few other counties. And I also hope that my own home county, Busia, will rise up to modernity and begin working in the modern space. They are really diving down into extinction, and I think they should copy the example of what the lady has. Maybe we should have more women governors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Omega, next
Right, thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
Bunyasi Sakwa, the chair of Kenya Development Corporation. Also, Patrick Obath, thank you for coming through, the chair of KEPSA Foundation. Also, we had the chair of Nairobi Security Exchange, Kiprono Kitoni, and the chair of Kenya Diaspora Alliance, Dr. Shemo Cholo. Thank you for your sentiments this morning. We pray that, of course, some of the things that you've indicated here and expressed will be taken seriously by policymakers in this country moving forward. Thank you very much for your valued company. You've been watching Sokoni here on Morning Prime. News Diary is up next.